So that brings us to this last talk of PyData, Berlin 2017, and it's Jonathan Ronen. He's PhD fellow at Max Delbrück Center, and he's going to talk about social networks and protest participation. So give him a big round of applause, please.
Hi. Thank you both for staying for the last talk. I'm sure that you know on this lovely Sunday afternoon. My name is Jonathan Ronen. I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm an electrical engineer by training. Then I worked a few years as a software engineer around Europe. Then I went to work as a data scientist in a computational social science lab at New York University. That's where this work I'm going to present right now is from. And currently I'm pursuing my PhD in computational biology here in Berlin. So I'm going to talk to you about this very famous protest that happened on January 11th, 2015, when hundreds of thousands of Parisians marched in the streets of Paris in a march culminating here at the Place de la République in solidarity with the victims of an attack at the headquarters of the Charlie Hebdo magazine. Now, this march wasn't a surprising event in any sense. We all knew this was going to happen. It was planned and announced in advance. But if I may be a little Tolstoyan about this, sorry, each one of these people made the decision to protest. Each one of them individually chose to go to protest. And the reasons that motivate people to participate in events like these have kept social scientists busy for many decades. It's conventionally believed that the decision to protest is a social one, but until recently, with all of the advances that you heard about in the last talk, it's been difficult for social scientists to tackle these questions in a context of a network structure with empirical data and not just game theoretic models. Researchers before have tried to address these questions using post-protest surveys, where they ask participants after the fact why they participated. Opp and Gurn interviewed participants in the marches in Leipzig in 1989, where they demanded reforms from the GDR government in protests that are largely seen as the beginning of the downfall of that oppressive regime, and where they showed that the social ties of these participants were crucial in motivating them to come out and protest under this repressive regime, where it was believed that people would fear to participate in protest because of the regime. McAdam and Paulsen interviewed people who participated in the Chicago Freedom Summer in 1963, which was an effort to register as many black and minority voters. And they also show that it wasn't just the social ties, but the salience of those social ties and the different spheres in which they occur that motivate people to participate. Both of these studies and others have a number of shortcomings. First of all, they are retrospective. Opp and Gurn interview people 1 year after the demonstration, while McAdam and Paulsen a couple of decades after the activist activities. They typically interview a small number of people, and they don't really have a network structure in that they ask people, did you know any other people who participated, but they don't know who your friends know, and so it's not really a network structure. Today, when people protest, they often post messages on social media announcing that they will protest, in addition to planning these in advance. And I'm sure that you can understand the big opportunities that this big data will enable us as social scientists to research this using big empirical data. We're not the first to notice this, of course. Here's a couple of really interesting Twitter networks papers. First, Pablo Barbera showed that using the Twitter network, you can actually estimate to very high accuracy people's political leaning on a left to right axis. Alexandra Siegel showed that the network structure of people participating in the Sunni Shia ugly slur debates on Twitter sort of show that people using the worst anti-sectarian slurs are actually embedded in more diverse networks, and this is actually a cross-sectarian conversation going on social media rather than just a flame war. So there's countless other studies, of course, and if we want to use this network to study protest participation, here's the sort of data set that we wish we could obtain, right? So first of all, we would like a set of confirmed protesters who went to the event. We'd like all of their social ties and all of the ties of their ties so that we can actually see the network structure that they're embedded in and not just their immediate friends who are also participants or not participants. And finally, we would like a set of control set users so that we may compare the network structures of the protesters to some sensible other set of potential protesters that chose not to protest. So we went ahead and collected this data set. First of all, before the protest, on the day of the attack, we set up a Twitter stream collection, tracking a number of the most popular hashtags and keywords that people used while discussing these events on Twitter. This was a fairly standard practice in the lab. Whenever something happened in the world that was might carry political participation from social media in the real world, we would start collecting all of these tweets. From all of these Charlie Hebdo, Je suis Charlie tweets, we were able to identify a set of 764 users who tweeted from the Place de la République during the last 2 hours of the march, so we're confident they were actually protesters. And we also identified a set of 1,000 control users who, while we're not sure they weren't at the march at some point, we're sure they weren't at the march on one particular point because they tweeted using geocoding from a distance away from the march at the time that it was going on. Now, like I said, we're not sure they didn't actually go to the protest, but I would say that any contamination we have of actual protesters into our control group would only make any claims we make later stronger. Finally, we build out a network from their friends and their friends' friends on Twitter, getting a big network structure. I'll just go through this visually again. First, we collect all of the tweets mentioning any of these hashtags. We draw a box around the Place de la République where we can filter out some users who tweet with geocoding from there or from a minimum distance away from there. We call those the participants and the controls. Then for each of these, we use the Twitter REST API to get all of the list of people they follow and build out the network. And finally, we pass that on to downstream analysis tools. So when we do this for our controls and our protesters, 2 degrees out, Twitter is actually a very small world network. We get 120 million nodes. This is actually not 120 million nodes. I had difficulties visualizing such a big network, so this is just a subsample of them. If you can see the colors on the screen, some of these dots are green, some of them are red. Those are protesters and controls. And the gray dots are just their friends. When you lay them out using a force-directed layout algorithm like this, you sort of see there's a community network emerging, where some people are followed by a few protesters, some by a few controls. You can't really use this to tell apart the participants from the non-participants. This isn't really the way to go forward. So in order to use this network to say something about how does the network motivate people to participate or not, we came up with this network theory of protest. We continue in the tradition of social science and game theory, saying that people choose to protest if the value of the protest is high enough for them. And further, that as my exposure to other people who value the protest highly increases, my own valuation of the protest is going to increase. And then in the context of Twitter, we say that, well, exposure is going to be a function of network distance as well as tie strength. So let me show you what we mean by that. We imagine Twitter as this big graph of follower relationships whereby we can sort of approximate the exposure of users to other users. So for instance, if A follows B or A has a tie to B, then we say A is exposed to B. Further, if B follows C, then even if A does not follow C, A is exposed to C, albeit to a lesser degree than its exposure to B, because B might retweet some of the things C says. People might also have reciprocated ties on Twitter where they follow each other. This indicates a stronger relationship, more likely to be an offline relationship. So we say this tie is stronger and therefore their exposure to each other more meaningful. And finally, with a triad centered around a user A, if A follows 2 users B and C, and at least one of them follows each other, we again know that these relationships are more likely to be offline relationships or have more context to them. And we say that A's exposure to both B and C is more meaningful than had C not followed B in that example. So using those definitions, let me walk you through some of the hypotheses we have about how the protesters' Twitter network might differ from that of control sets. So all the blue ones on the right here would signify protesters or just our controls. The red ones in the middle are people they follow. White ones outside there are people who their friends follow, but they don't actually follow themselves. So let's use this little toy example here to show you what I mean using the definitions I just went through. So our first hypothesis is that protesters will have more ties to other protesters than a random control group will have among themselves. So if you look at all of the bold ties over there and all of the not so bold ties over there, these are all ties that go from protesters to other people. And we expect that the proportion of ties that remain within the group will be higher for protesters than for controls. Second, we expect protesters to have more ties of ties to protesters. So all of the arrows that aren't dashed here are ties that go out from the middle layer of protesters' friends. And we expect that for protesters, more of these will go back to protesters than for the control group. Thirdly, if we look at triads centered at protesters, if you look at the topmost triad there, centered at protester, with two non-protester friends there. At the bottommost triad centered at another protester has another protester as a triad member. And we hypothesize that protesters will have more triads where at least one other member of the triad is a protester than control groups would have among themselves. And finally, we posit that protesters will have more strong ties to each other than control group members would have to each other. So using all the data we collected before, we're able to compute these statistics for all of the protesters and see if we're actually right about this. Do the protesters have a meaningfully different network structure than our control set? So first of all, ties within group. You can see we counted for each protesters what proportion of their ties goes to other protesters. For each control group member, what proportion of their ties goes back to another control group member. Again, you see this much higher spike at 0% for controls than for protesters. This is a log normal distribution, it seems like, and a highly significant difference between them. The same goes for ties of ties, with a much, again, a log normal distribution, with protesters having significantly more ties of ties to protesters than control group users have to other control group members. Triads that include another protester. Again, you see this very fat tail for protesters and a very sharp decline for controls, showing that, again, protesters have significantly more triads that include another protesters than controls do with another control. And finally, also with strong ties, we again see this log normal distribution with a significant difference, significantly more strong ties between protesters than between control group members. So all of these tests we've done here are also robust to our choice of control set. We thought, maybe there's just something funny about our Paris control that we chose. We gathered another control set of users who, rather than being Parisians, are just French and geo-tweet from France at some point. We show that this set is actually indistinguishable from the Paris control set in all of these tests that we have. They have the same ties within group, triads and strong ties, etc. Further, there's something on Twitter called verified accounts. These are typically different network hubs like newspapers, politicians, famous people. We thought these might bias us in some way. If Barack Obama or Justin Bieber follows one of the protesters, this might just seem like a denser network. So we remove all the verified accounts, and again, we recapitulate all of the results. Then we asked ourselves, well, what if these people that all tweeted from Place de la République are just a bunch of friends who go places and tweet together from there, and they're not protesters at all? To answer that, we just put a box around the Place de la République to see how often do people actually tweet from there that might not be protesters. And over a period of 2 weeks, when we tried that, nobody tweeted from there. So this is not like a Twitter user party gathering place. Also, we asked ourselves, well, what if these people just don't care about Charlie Hebdo or Paris users, and that's why they didn't go to the protest and everything else is incidental. But let me remind you, we collected these users from a set of users who had tweeted using some Charlie Hebdo hashtags. Here's the volume of tweets that mention Charlie Hebdo or the associated hashtags for, in the blue line on top, the protesters, and the green line in the middle, the attenders. The first spike right there is the day of the attack, and the second spike is the day of the march. And we see that there are similar levels of interest in this event, both for the control set Parisians we have, as well as the protesters. So these are really users, people who live in Paris, knew about this, cared about this, tweeted about this, by all accounts could have gone to the protest, but chose not to. So this is a very meaningful control group to compare to. Next, one reviewer asked us, well, how do you know these people didn't just meet at the protest and form all of these ties afterwards? We did, in fact, only gather all of these network ties after the protest had taken place. So using the Twitter API, you can't know when someone started following another user, but when you get their list of followers, it's chronologically ordered. So you know who the first user they started following is and who the last one is. So we figured out if that's the case, then the protester-protester ties would skew more towards the end of the list. This is not the case. These are normal distribution, both for protesters' ties to non-protesters, as well as protesters' ties among themselves. Some of you might be French speakers and noticed that the list of hashtags that I used earlier to pick these users actually included some very negative hashtags, such as I am not Charlie, or even I am Kouachi, where he was one of the shooters. And then we asked ourselves, well, oops, why did we even keep those in there? Maybe we just got a set of people who tweeted about this using the negative hashtags, and that's why they didn't show up to the protest. So all of the negative hashtags are actually exist in both groups, strangely enough, but in very low numbers. And most of these keywords are just neutral or positive to the protest. And finally, something I added just in the last minute, because topic models seems to be a hot topic in this conference. So we did it slightly differently here. Rather than topic modeling texts, I topic modeled the follower lists of people. So here I imagine that the generative process, rather than me picking a topic to write my document about and then picking a word from that distribution, I pick a topic to follow someone on Twitter from, and then I pick someone who belongs to that topic. So rather than topics being bags of words, topics are bags of popular Twitter accounts. Typically, these will be like, these are the football players, these are the left-wing politicians, these are comedians, etc. So, so I did this for all of the people in all three of our user sets, using all of the most followed accounts. In this big matrix here, each row is one of the users, and each column is one of the significant and robust topics that emerge when you do this analysis. If you can see, the color bar on the left side there has some green, red, and blue lines indicating whether this is a protester, a Paris person, non-protester, or a France control group, non-protester. And the pattern that emerges here is that we have some topics that are largely interesting for Paris people, whether they protested or not. We have some topics that are largely interesting for France people, whether they're Parisians or not. But if you'll see this dendrogram on the left side signifies I try to cluster people according to the people they follow on Twitter, without much greater success than that. So we can't really tell by whom you follow if you'll go to the protest. But we do actually observe in this data that there is a growing sphere of influence between the protesters, the Paris, and the France. But the signal is not clear enough to say any more than that. So in conclusion, we found compelling evidence both for the network structure hypotheses and the tie strength hypotheses, which is robust to the different control groups and all the other things I showed you. This is the first such large-scale empirical study showing that the structure of networks is important in motivating people, and I hope I've demonstrated that, as the previous speaker said, there's a lot to be gained from empirical data, big data in social science. further, we also got all of the tweets of these people. We were wondering if there's some way we could actually find causality in this data. Is it the structure of these networks that really motivated them, or is there something else that causes them both to form such networks and protest more? Is there any way we could use the texts of the tweets to find the motivation in Twitter, if the Twitter networks actually are important at all? So with that, I'd like to thank all of the tool makers, some of whom might have been at this conference today. With the help of all of these fantastic libraries, this was a very technically simple study to accomplish. And finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this work, Professor Jen Larson, who conceptualized the study and wrote the paper, and Professors Jonathan Nagler and Josh Tucker at NYU Politics, who were with us all through the process, and everybody else at the Social Media and Political Participation Lab at NYU. And thank you for listening.
Questions?
There's a question somewhere. No? I think I saw one. No?
I have a question. When you're doing topic modeling on the users, what kind of information do you collect about the user? Just the usernames, or their profile descriptions too?
So I collect no information about them except for who follows them. And when you're doing topic modeling on text, typically you'll have a bag of words representation of a document. So here I have a bag of Twitter accounts representation of each user. All the accounts you follow are the words, and I don't know anything else about them except who tends to be followed together.
Okay, so the model can be improved if you include other information like description of the accounts or their tweets.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of work on including informative priors in these topic models, and I've done none of that.
Great. So, any more questions?
Sure. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Have you tackled the problem on distinguishing between paid protests and normal protests? So the term astroturfing is something I think about.
So you mean if these people were paid to go protest? We haven't done anything about this. There was one anomaly we noticed in our data set where some of the accounts, none of the protesters, but some of the friends, if we just drew a histogram of how many people you follow, there seems to be like a decreasing, thing with a big peak around 2001. So we asked some people about this. One of them said, "Oh yeah, a lot of bots have exactly 2,000 people whom they follow." So all we did was again exclude all of these from the analysis. We're getting the same results. We didn't really look into who paid for these bots, where they came from. A very interesting thing to study on Twitter, of course.
Okay, hi, my name is Ulrike. I also study political sciences, and I did some Twitter stuff during my studies. And one thing I've noticed during the recent years that Twitter changes its access to its API sometimes. How did that relate to your work? Did you have difficulties with that? And besides my question, I just would like to point out a remark. What I noticed in your talk is that you concentrated a lot on building up the actual measurement model before going to your results. In comparison to the other talks I saw during this conference, that really stood out for me. And maybe a question for that. The second question: what do you think about the machine learning approaches, really digging in and exploring stuff, or setting up a measurement model?
I'm sorry, what was the first question again?
Twitter API changes.
Right. So I remember the changes that affected my work the most with this were the changing rate limits on Twitter. And without going into too much detail and sabotaging my future work and collaborators, you just need to be a bit clever about working around the Twitter API rate limits. And as for you know, setting out your hypotheses in advance versus exploratory data analysis, obviously that's what we did. We got all of the data. We thought of a million different statistics to compute, and we did that. This topic modeling is exactly that kind of thing. Where we just said, hey, what if we see something interesting there? This is an integral part of the work of computational social science, of course. But when you try to present these in a more compelling way, you say, hey, I thought of everything in advance, and then.
So if there are no more questions, we can thank the speaker. And